Hey there, it's Dr. Justin Marcagiani here. Welcome. We have Dr. Glen Livingston, clinical psychologist, in the house. We're going to be talking about eating disorders and your relationship with food. And again, I see this as a profound issue in my practice. We need a healthy relationship to food so we can start making health changes. And that starts with a whole food type of approach for sure. Dr. Glen, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I've been looking forward to this all week. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. And again, I'll give a little plug. Your site is neverbingeagain.com, Never Binge Again. And there's also your book there, which is the title of your book the same?
Same title, yes. Never Binge Again.
Title?
Yep.
Excellent.
Reprogram yourself to think like a permanently thin person on the food plan of your choice.
Love it. So we're going to do this interview here, guys. Everyone listening, anyone that has a question kind of pertinent to this topic, I'll ask Dr. Glen here these questions live on the air. Just try to keep it pertinent to the topic if you can. So Dr. Glen, talk to me about how you got into this niche. How did you evolve into this? And kind of where do your passions lie?
Well, the short answer is 30 years of suffering with binge eating myself. I was a child and family psychologist. I didn't really work with eating disorders, and I had a lot of trouble with an eating disorder myself. You would have diagnosed me as an exercise bulimic, which means that I'm 6'4", I'm reasonably muscular. And as a teenager, I figured out that if I exercised 2 or 3 hours a day, that I could eat whatever I wanted to, like 7,000 calories, double pizzas, boxes of muffins, whatever I wanted to. When I got married and started to have more responsibilities and patience and stuff, I found that I couldn't exercise like that, and my metabolism was slowing down. But I couldn't stop thinking about food and eating the way that I was. And so I gained weight and gained weight and gained weight, and my triglycerides looked like the national debt. And
totally.
Yeah, the doctors were telling me I was going to die by the time I was 35. Mm-hmm. But being a psychologist from a family of psychologists, I looked for the traditional ways of how to love myself better, like I could love myself then. And I went to the best psychologists, I went to the best psychiatrists, I went to Overeaters Anonymous. I even conducted a 40,000 person study because I was also a marketing consultant. I didn't have kids and I didn't commute. I conducted a very large study to figure out what the relationship was between different foods that people craved and several personality variables. But none of it really worked. I had all these soulful conversations. I found interesting things like people who struggle with chocolate like I did tended to be lonely or brokenhearted, and people who binged on salty, crunchy stuff, they tended to be stressed at work, et cetera, et cetera. But none of it really stopped the binge eating. It led to these soulful understandings of myself and self-forgiveness, so it was good to do. But ultimately, I decided that it's kind of like, there's the fire, and then there's the fireplace. And a lot of people think that to overcome emotional eating, they have to figure out all these coping mechanisms for the emotions, and they can't let the fire get too big. But I found that it's really more about constructing a good fireplace that keeps it contained. Ran into some alternative addiction treatment literature from Rational Recovery. And basically they pointed out that, the way our neuroanatomy is set up, we've got the lizard brain, which is kind of like the brain stem. And when the lizard brain looks at something in the environment, it says, do I eat it? Do I mate with it? Or do I kill it? Eat, mate, or kill. There's no love there. There's no long-term aspirations or goals or human identity. This is eat, mate, or kill. And this is what is targeted in addiction. I did a lot of consulting for big food, and I know the billions of dollars that go into creating these hyper-palatable food-like substances. Concentrations of starch and salt and oil and sugar and excitotoxins that are really designed to give us a dopaminergic hit, like a hit that our evolutionary system didn't prepare us for, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But later evolution developed like the neocortex and the mammalian brain, and it's actually superior to the lizard brain, and it can inhibit that. But if your paradigm is, well, I've got to love this thing more, bucks, and you hear this little voice in your head that says, chocolate comes from a cocoa bean, and a cocoa bean grows on a plant, so therefore chocolate's a vegetable, and you think, well, I must have to love myself more, you're going to let go of this, and this thing is going to run rampant through you. So long story short, this is kind of embarrassing, but what I decided was this thing was going to be my inner pig. I'm a kind of vegan guy, and I think real pigs are nice things in the world and need to be treated well, but this is not a nice thing, just a mental construct. This is my pig. I'm going to draw a line in the sand, like I will never eat chocolate on a weekday again. We can talk about why it's important to have rules like that, as opposed to just guidelines or progress, not perfection things.
Mm-hmm.
And chocolate itself was going to be pig slop. And when I heard this thing talking, this is a very condensed version, and it wanted chocolate, I'd say, well, that's just my pig. My pig wants chocolate. I don't eat pig slop, and I don't listen to farm animals tell me what to do. And after all the years of studying and all the money I put into it and all the psychologists and doctors and everything I went to, that's what wound up giving me the extra microseconds to wake up at the moment of impulse and remember who I was, who I wanted to be around that food, and start to make the right decision. And so what am I passionate about? This was just something I did for myself. I kept a journal. Mm-hmm. I turned the journal into a book on a whim, and it really took off and became the #1 book on Amazon for eating disorders. And so now I'm trying to help 1 million people a year to stop binge eating with this really weird method that everybody thinks is crazy, but until they try it and it works.
Well, I'm really curious to get into the actual method because, clinically we go to school, we get our degrees, we get training, which I think is like a minimum level of competency to kind of get out into the forest to see patients. And then you start studying people who are doing what actually works, and you start developing a skill set that's more application and results driven versus an academic, hey, you get your license kind of driven, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how, like you kind of walked out, you had these clinical PhD psychology skills from whatever university you went to. Where did you seek these new skills? How did you plug them into the model that you're doing now here?
Well, again, I was not treating eating disordered clients because I felt like I had one myself and I really wasn't good with it. So it wasn't fair. I was working with like suicidal adolescents and their families is really what I was doing. I had to be very present for that. And so my eating problem was an issue because I'd be sitting with this suicidal kid and thinking about when can I go get my next pizza, So I mean, I went for continuing education and I took, courses on eating disorders and I did some of that stuff. But really, when I tripped across these skills was for my personal benefit because I had been an Overeaters Anonymous and it just wasn't working for me. And so I was looking for alternative addiction treatment and I was searching the internet and reading books and I came across that book. That's where I got those skills. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So someone comes into you, right? There's like, because I work with a lot of patients that have eating disorders as well. So someone comes in, right? I kind of look at their past. Is there a history of abuse, trauma, like a lot of, overbearing, controlling people, abusive relationships, right? And then people are using food and they're overcompensating with the lack of control they have in their life. And they're controlling food in a way that may be unhealthy. So we kind of like look at past trauma and we say, is that controlling their eating now? So how do you separate the past issues, but also how do you separate just people eating a really crappy diet and they're not getting B vitamins or amino acids or certain nutrients to their brain and their brain can't function properly, or it's missing that dopamine from the building blocks it would normally get from food? How do you separate the past traumas with the nutritional work? And I know Dr. Julia Ross has talked a lot about this too in the Diet Cure and the Blue Cure.
Well, I don't think you can diagnose a psychological problem until you've ruled out the physical problem. So I think that if you are starving your body of the necessary nutrients, that really has to be addressed first and foremost, because if your body's not getting what it needs, then it will force you to be less discriminating with food until you get that. So I think that that's critically important. And I often joke with people, I said, look, you can't make a rule that says, I will never pee again, because your body has needs and it will eventually force you to do what you need to do. Just like you can't make a rule that says, I'm only going to have 500 calories a day and I'm not going to have any protein. And you just can't do that. So I really do believe that, people need to take a look at their diets and get themselves away from a lot of the industrial processed foods.
Right.
I think people are out there.
Refined sugar, right? Trans fats, those kind of things for sure.
Yeah, and all those bags and boxes and containers that everybody's looking for love at the bottom of, and it just doesn't exist. Once that's done, though, I do think that there is a very soulful relationship between food and trauma. I'll give you an example. Chocolate was always the beginning of my binge, right? If I didn't have chocolate, I didn't binge on anything else. Once I had a chocolate bar, then all bets were off. And when I did that 40,000 person study back in the year 2000, I found that people who struggled with chocolate tended to be lonely or brokenhearted. And I thought, well, I'm in not such a great marriage and I think I'm struggling with some of that. And my mom is a psychotherapist, so I'm going to say, let me ask her about my upbringing. Is there anything that would have started that pattern?
Mm.
And I had a really interesting conversation with her, and she said, you know, Glenn, when you were a toddler, I was really overwhelmed. Your dad was a captain in the Army, and they were going to take him to Vietnam. And my dad, your grandfather, was in prison. And I was terrified about when he was going to come back and, you know, what's going to happen. And I was just depressed. And so you would come running to me crying and wanting a hug, or maybe even wanting some healthy food. But I didn't have it to give you because I was just too depressed. I wanted to sit there and stare. And so sometimes I'd point to the bottle of chocolate Bosco on the floor, in the refrigerator on the floor, and I'd say, go get your Bosco. And you'd go running to the refrigerator, and you'd open up the Bosco and you'd suck on it and go into a sugar coma. And I thought, wow, there's the connection, right? Like maybe that insight should cure the problem, but it didn't, because there was this voice in my head that said, you know what, Glenn, you're right. Your mama didn't love you enough. And that's why you're binging on chocolate. And until you can figure out how to get that love in your life, you're just going to keep on binging. Let's go get some now. Like, yippee. It's almost became a justification. And that conversation helped me to forgive myself. I was more compassionate towards why I had this problem. I forgave my mom. We had a big hug, and I think we had a better relationship after we talked about that. So I think it's worth doing. But it was that voice in my head that really took over. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that these substances have a life of their own. Like, it kind of doesn't matter what struck the match. I mean, it does, and you can look for coping mechanisms, and you can make yourself more comfortable by learning how to deal with those emotions. But once you're on some of these things, you're actually kind of looking to get high with food. It's not just for comfort. Yeah. There were no chocolate bars on the savannah, right? Right. We didn't have these bags and boxes and containers in the tropics. These are substances that are really targeting a higher than normal release of neurotransmitters that give us a sense of artificial pleasure. And if you look at the animal studies on artificial pleasure, if you allow animals to self-stimulate, that you wire up an electrode to their brain and they can self-stimulate their pleasure center, they will forget about their survival needs. They will abandon their nursing pups. They will not eat food if they are starving. When you give people a pleasure button that doesn't really exist in nature, they get addicted, and the result of addiction is self-neglect. Yeah.
And there's a rat study too, where the rats would choose Oreo cookies over cocaine time and time again. So that's interesting. And then when you talk about like chocolate, for instance, right? Because there's almost a healthy version of any kind of food out there, right? Do you put like a 90% organic dark chocolate, no sugar added, in the same category as a refined chocolate bar with added sugar, or maybe a low antioxidant rate? Or are you kind of differentiating?
Well, I would certainly differentiate nutritionally, and I'm a psychologist, not a nutritionist, so I don't have as much to say about that. I think it's very individual. So, I work with a lot of people who eat chocolate every day, and it works out really well for them. Personally, I just can't have it at all. I just get carried away, and none is easier than some. But I do think that there are gradations of healthier versus less healthy foods, and I certainly think that one strategy for becoming healthier is to substitute healthier for less healthier versions.
Got it. So I'm a new patient. I'm coming to you right now, right? And I know you'd have to have an in-depth, examination or intake and really go through things. But what are the top 3 things that you're going to look at with me, and what changes are you going to make off the bat? And I know it's a hypothetical here, but just people that are listening, so they can get a sense of how they can start applying some of the tools that you work with on a daily basis.
Well, I'd ask you what your single most troublesome trigger food or behavior is. Is it eating in the car? Is it chocolate? Is it having dessert at a restaurant? What's the single most troublesome trigger food or behavior? And then I'd ask you, what kind of person would you like to be ideally around that food? So some people will say, gee, I wish I could have dessert just twice a week in a restaurant, and no more than that. Other people would say, I want dessert totally out of my life. Some people will say, I always want to put my fork down between bites. Whatever it is, I would concentrate on that one rule, and I'd ask them, could they make a rule that says, I will always put my fork down between bites. And once you make a very clear line in the sand, you can start to listen for that inner voice that suggests that you break that rule. And I just want to teach them how the game is played. I'm not so worried about them losing weight right away. excuse me, I just want to teach them how the game is played, because see, in our culture, we're told that we're really powerless over these impulses. We can't really hope to quit. We can only abstain one day at a time. We should strive for progress, not perfection. The advertising industry spends billions of dollars to convince us that we need this. People think advertising doesn't affect them, but it actually affects them more when they think it doesn't affect them, because their sales resistances are down. So there's like a perfect storm to create this sense of powerlessness. And so I want to find one rule and play this game, in one way, to prove to people that they do have the power to control themselves. Okay. And then I ask them to start listening for why they can't always put their fork down between bites, or why they can't only have chocolate on a weekday. And we start to look at what those voices in their head are telling them, and we dispute them. We also look at if you were to do this, let's say you could do it perfectly. I know that your inner pig says that you can't, but if you could do it perfectly for a year, what would happen in your life? What kind of person would you be if you didn't have chocolate during the week for all of 2018, right?
Right.
And we really dimensionalize that to help with the motivation. That's what I do.
Yeah, interesting. And you mentioned your inner pig. I know a lot of people in the NLP world, they'll envision that stop sign coming in their face, or they'll have a rubber band and they'll create some kind of a neurofeedback that's a negative stimuli. Is that what you're kind of doing with that, with the pig analogy there? Trying to create a negative feedback stimuli? Yeah,
it's I'm trying to help people to view the impulse to binge.
Yeah,
it's almost like a challenging wolf to the alpha wolf in the pack.
Yeah.
So rather than trying to love your inner self, what you're trying to do is dominate a challenger for leadership. And it's just enough to wake you up. It's just enough to wake you up and remind you of who you want to be when you experience the impulse, and to start to snarl it down or just ignore it as an irrelevant challenger.
Got it.
That's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Okay. So I kind of look at eating disorders in a couple ways, right? You kind of talked about maybe some abnormal cravings, where cravings are just kind of controlling you. Then there's people that are binging to the point where they know they're going to purge afterwards, right? Where they have the anorexia side, where it's just purely starvation. And then a lot of times there's this body image thing where they see themselves as maybe looking 50 to 100 pounds heavier in the mirror. How do you differentiate those? Like, how do you treat one different than the other, or do you?
Well, okay, I can't necessarily offer this as treatment, because some of what I'm saying goes against the standards of care in my practice. So, although the evidence seems to point to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very consistent with this as being most effective for binge eating anyway. With people who are bulimic, if you don't binge, then you won't purge. So if we focus on stopping the binges, then they tend to get better. I don't have a lot of success with anorexic people. I think that it's a more complex disorder, and there's something I don't quite understand about it yet. I've not had a lot of success with it. The evidence for it is not terrific for anything working great. Some people, if you make a food plan that says I will have 3 regular meals with nothing in between, I'll eat my entire meal no matter what, and you look at the voice that tells you that you don't deserve to eat, or that you have to, you have to starve, otherwise you're sinning or something. If you look at those voices that are associated with anorexia, some people have some success doing that, but I don't think any more than any other method. So I tend to encourage anorexics to seek treatment elsewhere.
Got it. Understandable. So any other tools that you're coming out with, or that you're working with people on, maybe on the craving side, that you want to add in there?
Well, we're developing some Facebook software that won't be out for another 6 months or so, but there is some evidence that recruiting your friends to cheer you on and reward you as you go on tiny little quests, like today we'll have only 1 cup of coffee, and people kind of watch you report about that, and like your status when you say that you did it, and cheer you on if you had made a mistake and help you get back up. There's some evidence that works well. And so we're developing some software that integrates with Facebook to help us to do that. And it looks promising. But that won't be out for 6 months or a year.
And how much of it do you think the neurotransmitters, you mentioned like the dopamine earlier. How much is it that people are just craving that hit of dopamine and they're just choosing I break them down into destructive and constructive, right? So our constructive vehicles for improving brain chemistry may be things like exercise. It may be things like meditation. It may be prayer. It may be a nutrient dense diet. It may be engaging in therapies that you talk about that are building up and sustainable. And then we kind of have the destructive ones, which are maybe the junky chocolate or even recreational drugs. How do you differentiate, those constructive or destructive vehicles, like I mentioned, to the people that you're working with?
Well, I would probably draw the same lines that you are. Mm-hmm. I also try to explain to them the phenomenon of downregulation and upregulation, which means that if you're having a chocolate bar every day, then an apple doesn't taste the way that it's supposed to. It doesn't give you the same level of pleasure that you're supposed to get from an apple because your taste buds are no longer as responsive and the whole dopamine response system is not as responsive as it should be to what nature provided. And so your inner pig will say, you're going to feel awful if you don't have this chocolate bar. You need this to survive. You're going to have no pleasure in your life. Life is going to be very depressing. But the research suggests that when you stop overstimulating the taste buds, that they, double in sensitivity in a matter of weeks, that your, brain starts to upregulate and respond to natural stimuli again in the way that it was supposed to in the first place. And before you know it, a banana or an apple gives you just about the same amount of pleasure as the chocolate did. It doesn't quite get you high with food in the same way, but it does give you an unbelievable amount of pleasure that you're not supposed to believe exists at this point if you're hooked on chocolate.
Totally. And then regarding supplementation, I mean, what's your experience with that? Are you using B6 or P5P or any certain B vitamins? Are you doing any amino acid or omega-3 therapy along with it to help support the brain and the nervous system?
Well, I'm not because I don't really have that expertise, but I'd be curious what you recommend and why.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I see a lot of Dr. Julia Ross's work and other people, B6 is really important for neurotransmitter synthesis. Obviously, getting cortisol levels under control because the more the stress hormones are out of balance, the more you tend to burn up neurotransmitters. And it kind of makes sense because a lot of those neurotransmitters like dopamine can go downstream to adrenaline. So it makes sense if we're throwing more gasoline on the fire, then we can burn that gasoline up. So yeah, I'd be curious to get your connection and how that works together for you. But very cool.
I'm afraid I might be inadequate to comment on that just because I don't have the training to do that. But,
totally.
but it makes sense to me.
Totally.
My experience is that the more people supplement with a nutrient-dense diet, the less they want to binge.
Totally. And what about inflammation? Does that work in there to you as well?
I personally choose a whole foods plant-based diet because it removed all the inflammation from my system. And, I used to have eczema and psoriasis and rosacea fairly badly. And it all went away when I started to do that. There was a product called Inflamex that I took for a while. And I did notice. Metagenics. Yeah. I did notice that I was less interested in sugar and starch as I was taking that. So I think there's something about the body having a craving for certain nutrients when inflammation is existing in the body. How would you explain that? What am I missing?
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I think the more inflamed you are, the more your body's going to burn through alkaline buffering minerals like potassium and magnesium. It's going to burn through B vitamins. For sure, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that explains your experience. And I'm just curious too, what was your diet like before you made these switches in yourself? Can you give me like a pre and a post?
Well, if it wasn't nailed down, it was fair game. Let's just say that.
I get it. The seafood diet, right?
Yeah.
Eat it. That's it.
Yeah. No, I was eating, I was
fast
always
food, those kind of things.
I was eating a lot of fast food. I would try to eat healthy in between, but to me that meant, like a lot of salmon and salad and not really horrific things, but I was eating so much in between that it was just countering everything. Yeah. Spend the day at Taco Bell, that kind of thing.
And how about now? Like, what does your diet look like today? Can you give us a quick rundown, breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
Oh, God, it's very simple, and most people would run away screaming, but I eat almost entirely fruits and vegetables. Today for breakfast.
How about your protein sources? Are you doing like legumes or lentils? Are you doing a
sometimes
or hemp?
Sometimes I'm largely raw. I'm largely raw, and I feel better when I'm largely raw. But I'll get 60 grams of protein minimum per day, no matter what I do.
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent. And then had one more quick question for you that was really on that vein. So we talked about the raw, we talked about the amino acids. Oh, it'll come to me. We talked about the B vitamins and supplementation. It's just on the tip of my tongue. I'll come back to it here in just a minute. So you're making all out of these. Oh yeah, this is what it is. We talked about a pre-show about fasting. Why is it? And I'm on the same belief as you on this. Why is it that you are not recommending fasting for individuals that have these issues off the bat?
Mostly because I see them rebounding.
Yeah.
I believe there must be an evolutionary mechanism that says if calories and nutrition are unavailable for a long period of time, then as soon as they are available, we really ought to hoard them. And I think that's why people feel like there's a switch that's flipped in their brain sometimes, and why being full can be a trigger to really binge more, which doesn't make any common sense otherwise. So I believe that the fasting sets up a cycle which just doesn't work for binge eaters. I do believe that there are medical benefits to fasting. I have done it myself for medical reasons, but supervised by a doctor, and very, very careful with the transition back to real food, and very much aware of the tendency to want to binge once you come off of it. When I was a kid, I fasted and broke it with Taco Bell, and that didn't make me feel so good.
Totally. Yeah, I see a lot of the fasting benefits initially is if you're doing, we got to differentiate like with an intermittent fast versus a fast where there's no food for a couple days on end. Yeah. Intermittent fast, I think, number one, you're still getting the same amount of calories in, which means same amount of nutrients in, but you just got to really structure those 2 meals up. Like if you're doing an 18/6 or a 16/8, the bigger numbers, the amount of time you're fasting, and that 6 or 8 hour window, you just have to make sure you have 2 solid meals in there and you're getting adequate calories. But number two, the larger fast, I think, can be beneficial for people if they're eating a whole bunch of crap, because your body will surprisingly do a little bit better off of nothing than a whole bunch of crap. But it's better to eat something that's nutrient dense than nothing at all, because when you're under this kind of stress, your body's burning nutrients. And then when you are not putting those nutrients in, it starts to have to catabolically break down other tissues in the body, tendons, ligaments, neurotransmitters, etc.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense, yeah.
So in your book, is there anything else you want to kind of connect the dots that was like an aha for you, or patients that you work with? These principles were really having a major effect on people 80% of the time. Anything else you want to touch upon before we wrap up?
Yeah, Janine Roth pointed out that there are 2 types of deprivation. And most people, when they're considering switching their diet or letting go of certain, junky things in their diet, they get very involved with the voice in their head that says, oh, you're going to be so deprived of all this pleasure. But if you ask yourself, what are you depriving yourself of in the future if you continue to eat like you're eating? Like, what's your life going to be like in a year if you continue to do this? And are you going to be heavier? Are you going to have problems with your cardiovascular system, or cancer, or diabetes, or what? And what about the energy you would have if you stopped eating this? And what about being able to play with your kids and feel more confident in yourself? And what about the deprivation of all of that associated with continuing to do what you're doing? So it's never a question of whether you'll be deprived. It's a question of what you'll be deprived of. And if you take a moment to fully consider what you might be deprived of, then you can make the decision, do I want to live fast and die young, or live a little slower and have a little more enjoyment in my life?
Interesting. And one thing I also noted too is that people kind of look at food. They kind of look at food for your brain or food for your body as just like gasoline in the gas tank, right? You go to your car, you go to the gas station, you put the gasoline in the tank, and that's it. And it burns that gasoline up. You get the E signal, you come back and do it again. The difference is the food that we eat, actually, if we use the car analogy, that's like the gasoline becoming the building blocks for the bumper or for the headlights or for the engine, because we're constantly breaking up and building down, right? So food, people, I think, use the calorie model, which is kind of a heat model, right? Energy model. And they're not using it as like a building block type of model. Hey, these are going to be the raw material for your future cells. And one thing that I do is shifting the mindset of energy versus building blocks for building your temple, your house, your body, your brain. And that, I think, helps shift the value set of it's really important, because this is becoming me versus, hey, this is just something I'm throwing in my gas tank. Thoughts on that?
I'd like to borrow that. I think that, that's a good paradigm shift. It would make people, because it's possible to rationalize eating a chocolate bar based on the fact that I need the energy, right?
Right. I'll burn it off. Not a big deal.
Right. right? As opposed to this is going to become part of me. And do I want this to become part of me, or do I want an apple to become part of me?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, good.
Yeah. I'd like to borrow that.
That's perfect. Yeah, totally. And anything else you want to let the listeners know before we let you go here?
Well, can I send them to the website to get a couple of free things?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally.
At neverbingeagain.com, you can get a free copy of the book in Kindle, Nook, or PDF format. I've also recorded a whole bunch of coaching sessions for free, so that you can hear how this is implemented in practice, because it sounds kind of weird in a short little interview. In the abstract, it sounds kind of harsh, but it's not. And I created a set of food plan starter templates for any diet. So whether you're paleo or vegan or whole foods, whatever you are, point counters, there'll be something that kind of matches with your philosophy and gets you started. Neverbingeagain.com.
We'll put that in the show notes, Never Binge Again. So if you're driving or you're somewhere you can't check that out, click the show notes below. We'll have that link there. Dr. Glen, thank you so much for this awesome information. We'll get this out there, and feel free and share that with your listeners too. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much.